You can save yourself the trouble, Doctor. Everything reminds me of sex. Does it? Cried Major Sanderson with delight, as though unable to believe his ears. Now we're really getting somewhere. Do you ever have any good sex dreams? My fish dream is a sex dream. No, I mean real sex dreams, the kind where you grab some naked bitch by the neck and pinch her and punch her in the face until she's all bloody and then throw yourself down to ravish her and burst into tears because you love her and hate her so much you don't know what else to do. That's the kind of sex dreams I like to talk about. Don't you ever have sex dreams like that? Yossarian reflected a moment with a wise look. That's a fish dream, he decided. Major Sanderson recoiled as though he had been slapped. Yes, of course, he conceded frigidly, his manner changing to one of edgy and defensive antagonism. But I'd like you to dream one like that anyway just to see how you react. That will be all for today. In the meantime, I'd also like you to dream up the answers to some of those questions I asked you. These sessions are no more pleasant for me than they are for you, you know. I'll mention it to Dunbar, Yossarian replied. Dunbar? He's the one who started it all. It's his dream. Oh, Dunbar. Major Sanderson sneered, his confidence returning. I'll bet Dunbar is that evil fellow who really does all those nasty things you're always being blamed for, isn't he? He's not so evil. And yet you'll defend him to the very death, won't you? Not that far. Major Sanderson smiled tauntingly and wrote Dunbar on his pad. Why are you limping? He asked sharply, as Yossarian moved to the door. And what the devil is that bandage doing on your leg? Are you mad or something? I was wounded in the leg. That's what I'm in the hospital for. Oh, no, you're not, gloated Major Sanderson maliciously. You're in the hospital for a stone in your salivary gland. So you're not so smart after all, are you? You don't even know what you're in the hospital for. I'm in the hospital for a wounded leg, Yossarian insisted. Major Sanderson ignored his argument with a sarcastic laugh. Well, give my regards to your friend Dunbar. And you will tell him to dream that dream for me, won't you? But Dunbar had nausea and dizziness with his constant headache and was not inclined to cooperate with Major Sanderson. Hungry Joe had nightmares because he had finished 60 missions and was waiting again to go home, but he was unwilling to share any when he came to the hospital to visit. Hasn't anyone got any dreams for Major Sanderson? Yossarian asked. I hate to disappoint him. He feels so rejected already. I've been having a very peculiar dream ever since I learned you were wounded, confessed the chaplain. I used to dream every night that my wife was dying or being murdered or that my children were choking to death on morsels of nutritious food. Now I dream that I'm out swimming in water over my head and a shark is eating my left leg in exactly the same place where you have your bandage. That's a wonderful dream, Dunbar declared. I bet Major Sanderson will love it. That's a horrible dream. Major Sanderson cried. It's filled with pain and mutilation and death. I'm sure you had it just to spite me. You know, I'm not even sure you belong in the army, with a disgusting dream like that. Yossarian thought he spied a ray of hope. Perhaps you're right, sir, he suggested slyly. Perhaps I ought to be grounded and return to the States. Hasn't it ever occurred to you that in your promiscuous pursuit of women you are merely trying to assuage your subconscious fears of sexual impotence? Yes, sir, it has. Then why do you do it? To assuage my fears of sexual impotence. Why don't you get yourself a good hobby instead? Major Sanderson inquired with friendly interest. Like fishing. Do you really find Nurse Duckett so attractive? I should think she was rather bony. Rather bland and bony, you know. Like a fish. I hardly know Nurse Duckett. Then why did you grab her by the bosom? Merely because she has won? Dunbar did that. Oh, don't start that again, Major Sanderson exclaimed with vitriolic scorn, and hurled down his pencil disgustedly. Do you really think that you can absolve yourself of guilt by pretending to be someone else? I don't like you, for sure. Do you know that? I don't like you at all. Yossarian felt a cold, damp wind of apprehension blow over him. "I'm not Fortiori, sir," he said timidly. "I'm Yossarian." "You are who?" "My name is Yossarian, sir. And I'm in the hospital with a wounded leg." "Your name is Fortiori," Major Sanderson contradicted him belligerently. "And you're in the hospital for a stone in your salivary gland." "Oh, come on, Major." Yossarian exploded. "I ought to know who I am. And I've got an official Army record here to prove it," Major Sanderson retorted. "You'd better get a grip on yourself before it's too late. First you're Dunbar. Now you're Yossarian. The next thing you know you'll be claiming you're Washington Irving. Do you know what's wrong with you? You've got a split personality, that's what's wrong with you." "Perhaps you're right, sir." Yossarian agreed diplomatically. "I know I'm right. You've got a bad persecution complex. You think people are trying to harm you. People are trying to harm me. You see? You have no respect for excessive authority or obsolete traditions. You're dangerous and depraved, and you ought to be taken outside and shot. Are you serious? You are an enemy of the people. Are you nuts?" Yossarian shouted. "No, I'm not nuts," Dobbs roared furiously back in the ward, in what he imagined was a furtive whisper. "Hungry Joe saw them, I tell you. He saw them yesterday when he flew to Naples to pick up some black market air conditioners for Colonel Cathcart's farm. They've got a big replacement center there and it's filled with hundreds of pilots, bombardiers and gunners on the way home. They've got 45 missions, that's all. A few with Purple Hearts have even less. Replacement crews are pouring in from the States into the other bomber groups. They want everyone to serve overseas at least once, even administrative personnel. Don't you read the papers? We've got to kill him now. You've got only 2 more missions to fly," Yossarian reasoned with him in a low voice. "Why take a chance? I can get killed flying them, too," Dobbs answered pugnaciously in his rough, quavering, overwrought voice. "We can kill him the first thing tomorrow morning when he drives back from his farm. I've got the gun right here." Yossarian goggled with amazement as Dobbs pulled a gun out of his pocket and displayed it high in the air. "Are you crazy?" he hissed frantically. "Put it away. And keep your idiot voice down." "What are you worried about?" Dobbs asked with offended innocence. "No one can hear us." "Hey, knock it off down there," a voice rang out from the far end of the ward. "Can't you see we're trying to nap? What the hell are you, a wise guy?" Dobbs yelled back and spun around with clenched fists, ready to fight. He whirled back to Yossarian and, before he could speak, sneezed thunderously 6 times, staggering sideways on rubbery legs in the intervals and raising his elbows ineffectively to fend each seizure off. The lids of his watery eyes were puffy and inflamed. "Who does he think?" he demanded, sniffing spasmodically and wiping his nose with the back of his sturdy wrist. "He is, a cop or something?" "He's a CID man," Yossarian notified him tranquilly. "We've got 3 here now and more on the way. Oh, don't be scared. They're after a forger named Washington Irving. They're not interested in murderers." "Murderers?" Dobbs was affronted. "Why do you call us murderers? Just because we're going to murder Colonel Cathcart?" "Be quiet, damn you," directed Yossarian. "Can't you whisper?" "I am whispering." You are still shouting." "No, I'm not." Hey, shut up down there, will you?" Patients all over the ward began hollering at Dobbs. "I'll fight you all." Dobbs screamed back at them, and stood up on a rickety wooden chair, waving the gun wildly. Yossarian caught his arm and yanked him down. Dobbs began sneezing again. "I have an allergy," he apologized when he had finished, his nostrils running and his eyes streaming with tears. "That's too bad. You'd make a great leader of men without it." "Colonel Cathcart's the murderer," Dobbs complained hoarsely when he had shoved away a soiled, crumpled khaki handkerchief. "Colonel Cathcart's the one who's going to murder us all if we don't do something to stop him. Maybe he won't raise the missions anymore. Maybe 60 is as high as he'll go. He always raises the missions. You know that better than I do. Dobbs swallowed and bent his intense face very close to Yossarian's, the muscles in his bronze, rock-like jaw bunching up into quivering knots. Just say it's okay and I'll do the whole thing tomorrow morning. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I'm whispering now, ain't I? Yossarian tore his eyes away from the gaze of burning entreaty Dobbs had fastened on him. Why the goddamn hell don't you just go out and do it? He protested. Why don't you stop talking to me about it and do it alone? I'm afraid to do it alone. I'm afraid to do anything alone. Then leave me out of it. I'd have to be crazy to get mixed up in something like this now. I've got $1 million leg wound here. They're going to send me home. Are you crazy? Dobbs exclaimed in disbelief. All you've got there is a scratch. He'll have you back flying combat missions the day you come out, Purple Heart and all. Then I really will kill him, Yossarian vowed. I'll come looking for you and we'll do it together. Then let's do it tomorrow while we've still got the chance, Dobbs pleaded. The chaplain says he's volunteered the group for Avignon again. I may be killed before you get out. Look how these hands of mine shake. I can't fly a plane. I'm not good enough. Yossarian was afraid to say yes. I want to wait and see what happens first. The trouble with you is that you just won't do anything, Dobbs complained in a thick infuriated voice. I'm doing everything I possibly can, the chaplain explained softly to Yossarian after Dobbs had departed. I even went to the medical tent to speak to Doc Danica about helping you. Yes, I can see. Yossarian suppressed a smile. What happened? They painted my gums purple, the chaplain replied sheepishly. They painted his toes purple, too, Nately added in outrage. And then they gave him a laxative. But I went back again this morning to see him. And they painted his gums purple again, said Nately. But I did get to speak to him, the chaplain argued in a plaintive tone of self-justification. Dr. Danica seems like such an unhappy man. He suspects that someone is plotting to transfer him to the Pacific Ocean. All this time he's been thinking of coming to me for help. When I told him I needed his help, he wondered if there wasn't a chaplain I couldn't go see. The chaplain waited in patient dejection when Yossarian and Dunbar both broke into laughter. I used to think it was immoral to be unhappy, he continued, as though keening aloud in solitude. Now I don't know what to think anymore. I'd like to make the subject of immorality the basis of my sermon this Sunday, but I'm not sure I ought to give any sermon at all with these purple gums. Colonel Corn was very displeased with them. Chaplain, why don't you come into the hospital with us for a while and take it easy? Yossarian invited. You could be very comfortable here. The brash iniquity of the proposal tempted and amused the chaplain for a second or two. No, I don't think so, he decided reluctantly. I want to arrange for a trip to the mainland to see a male clerk named Wintergreen. Dr. Danica told me he could help. Wintergreen is probably the most influential man in the whole theater of operations. He's not only a male clerk, but he has access to a mimeograph machine. But he won't help anybody. That's one of the reasons he'll go far. I'd like to speak to him anyway. There must be somebody who will help you. Do it for Dunbar, chaplain, Yossarian corrected with a superior air. I've got this $1 million leg wound that will take me out of combat. If that doesn't do it, there's a psychiatrist who thinks I'm not good enough to be in the army. I'm the one who isn't good enough to be in the army, Dunbar whined jealously. It was my dream. It's not the dream, Dunbar, Yossarian explained. He likes your dream. It's my personality. He thinks it's split. It's split right down the middle, said Major Sanderson, who had laced his lumpy GI shoes for the occasion and had slicked his charcoal dull hair down with some stiffening and redolent tonic. He smiled ostentatiously to show himself reasonable and nice. I'm not saying that to be cruel and insulting, he continued with cruel and insulting delight. I'm not saying it because I hate you and want revenge. I'm not saying it because you rejected me and hurt my feelings terribly. No, I'm a man of medicine and I'm being coldly objective. I have very bad news for you. Are you man enough to take it? God, no! Screamed Yossarian. I'll go right to pieces. Major Sanderson flew instantly into a rage. Can't you even do one thing right? He pleaded, turning beet red with vexation and crashing the sides of both fists down upon his desk together. The trouble with you is that you think you're too good for all the conventions of society. You probably think you're too good for me too, just because I arrived at puberty late. Well, do you know what you are? You're a frustrated, unhappy, disillusioned, undisciplined, maladjusted young man. Major Sanderson's disposition seemed to mellow as he reeled off the uncomplimentary adjectives. Yes, sir, Yossarian agreed carefully. I guess you're right. Of course I'm right. You're immature. You've been unable to adjust to the idea of war. Yes, sir. You have a morbid aversion to dying. You probably resent the fact that you're at war and might get your head blown off any second. I more than resent it, sir. I'm absolutely incensed. You have deep-seated survival anxieties. And you don't like bigots, bullies, snobs or hypocrites. Subconsciously there are many people you hate. Consciously, sir, consciously, Yossarian corrected in an effort to help. I hate them consciously. You are antagonistic to the idea of being robbed, exploited, degraded, humiliated or deceived. Misery depresses you. Ignorance depresses you. Persecution depresses you. Violence depresses you. Slums depress you. Greed depresses you. Crime depresses you. Corruption depresses you. You know, it wouldn't surprise me if you're a manic depressive. Yes, sir. Perhaps I am. Don't try to deny it. I'm not denying it, sir, said Yossarian, pleased with the miraculous rapport that finally existed between them. I agree with all you've said. Then you admit you're crazy, do you? Crazy? Yossarian was shocked. What are you talking about? Why am I crazy? You're the one who's crazy. Major Sanderson turned red with indignation again and crashed both fists down upon his thighs. Calling me crazy, he shouted in a sputtering rage, is a typically sadistic and vindictive paranoiac reaction. You really are crazy. Then why don't you send me home? And I'm going to send you home. They are going to send me home, Yossarian announced jubilantly, as he hobbled back into the ward. Me too. A fortiori rejoiced. They just came to my ward and told me. What about me? Dunbar demanded petulantly of the doctors. You? They replied with asperity. You are going with Yossarian. Right back into combat. And back into combat they both went. Yossarian was enraged when the ambulance returned him to the squadron, and he went limping for justice to Doc Danica, who glared at him glumly with misery and disdain. You! Doc Danica exclaimed mournfully with accusing disgust, the egg-shaped pouches under both eyes firm and censorious. All you ever think of is yourself. Go take a look at the bomb line if you want to see what's been happening since you went to the hospital. Yossarian was startled. Are we losing? Losing? Doc Danica cried. The whole military situation has been going to hell ever since we captured Paris. I knew it would happen. He paused, his sulking ire turning to melancholy, and frowned irritably as though it were all Yossarian's fault. American troops are pushing into German soil. The Russians have captured back all of Romania. Only yesterday the Greeks in the 8th Army captured Rimini. The Germans are on the defensive everywhere. Doc Danica paused again and fortified himself with a huge breath for a piercing ejaculation of grief. There's no more Luftwaffe left. He wailed. He seemed ready to burst into tears. The whole Gothic line is in danger of collapsing. So? Asked Yossarian. What's wrong? What's wrong? Doc Danica cried. If something doesn't happen soon, Germany may surrender. And then we'll all be sent to the Pacific. Yossarian gawked at Doc Danica in grotesque dismay. Are you crazy? Do you know what you're saying? Yeah, it's easy for you to laugh, Doc Danica sneered. Who the hell is laughing? At least you've got a chance. You're in combat and might get killed. But what about me? I've got nothing to hope for. You are out of your goddamn head. Yossarian shouted at him emphatically, seizing him by the shirt front. Do you know that? Now keep your stupid mouth shut and listen to me. Doc Danica wrenched himself away. Don't you dare talk to me like that. I'm a licensed physician. Then keep your stupid licensed physician's mouth shut and listen to what they told me up at the hospital. I'm crazy. Did you know that? So? Really crazy. So? I'm nuts. Cuckoo. Don't you understand? I'm off my rocker. They sent someone else home in my place by mistake. They've got a licensed psychiatrist up at the hospital who examined me, and that was his verdict. I'm really insane. So? So? Yossarian was puzzled by Doc Danica's inability to comprehend. Don't you see what that means? Now you can take me off combat duty and send me home. They're not going to send a crazy man out to be killed, are they? Who else will go? 28 Dobbs Mquat went, and Mquat was not crazy. And so did Yossarian, still walking with a limp, and when Yossarian had gone 2 more times and then found himself menaced by the rumor of another mission to Bologna, he limped determinedly into Dobbs's tent early one warm afternoon, put a finger to his mouth and said, "Shush." "What are you shushing him for?" asked Kid Sampson, peeling a tangerine with his front teeth as he perused the dog-eared pages of a comic book. "He isn't even saying anything." "Screw," said Yossarian to Kid Sampson, jerking his thumb back over his shoulder toward the entrance of the tent. Kid Sampson cocked his blond eyebrows discerningly and rose to cooperate. He whistled upward 4 times into his drooping yellow mustache and spurted away into the hills on the dented old green motorcycle he had purchased second-hand months before. Yossarian waited until the last faint bark of the motor had died away in the distance. Things inside the tent did not seem quite normal. The place was too neat. Dobbs was watching him curiously, smoking a fat cigar. Now that Yossarian had made up his mind to be brave, he was deathly afraid. "All right," he said. "Let's kill Colonel Cathcart. We'll do it together." Dobbs sprang forward off his cot with a look of wildest terror. "Shush!" he roared. "Kill Colonel Cathcart? What are you talking about?" "Be quiet, damn it," Yossarian snarled. "The whole island will hear. Have you still got that gun? Are you crazy or something?" shouted Dobbs. "Why should I want to kill Colonel Cathcart? Why?" Yossarian stared at Dobbs with an incredulous scowl. "Why? It was your idea, wasn't it? Didn't you come to the hospital and ask me to do it?" Dobbs smiled slowly. "But that was when I had only 58 missions," he explained, puffing on his cigar luxuriously. "I'm all packed now and I'm waiting to go home. I've finished my 60 missions." "So what?" Yossarian replied. "He's only going to raise them again. Maybe this time he won't. He always raises them." "What the hell's the matter with you, Dobbs? Ask Hungry Joe how many times he's packed his bags." "I've got to wait and see what happens," Dobbs maintained stubbornly. "I'd have to be crazy to get mixed up in something like this now that I'm out of combat." He flicked the ash from his cigar. "No, my advice to you," he remarked, "is that you fly your 60 missions like the rest of us and then see what happens." Yossarian resisted the impulse to spit squarely in his eye. "I may not live through 60, he wheedled in a flat, pessimistic voice. "There's a rumor around that he volunteered the group for Bologna again." "It's only a rumor," Dobbs pointed out with a self-important air. "You mustn't believe every rumor you hear. Will you stop giving me advice?" "Why don't you speak to Orr?" Dobbs advised. "Orr got knocked down into the water again last week on that second mission to Avignon. Maybe he's unhappy enough to kill him. Or hasn't got brains enough to be unhappy." Or had been knocked down into the water again while Yossarian was still in the hospital and had eased his crippled airplane down gently into the glassy blue swells off Marseille with such flawless skill that not one member of the 6-man crew suffered the slightest bruise. The escape hatches in the front and rear sections flew open while the sea was still foaming white and green around the plane, and the men scrambled out as speedily as they could in their flaccid orange Mae West life jackets that failed to inflate and dangled limp and useless around their necks and waists. The life jackets failed to inflate because Milo had removed the twin carbon dioxide cylinders from the inflating chambers to make the strawberry and crushed pineapple ice cream sodas he served in the officers' mess hall and had replaced them with mimeographed notes that read, "What's good for M&M Enterprises is good for the country." Or popped out of the sinking airplane last. You should have seen him. Sergeant Knight roared with laughter as he related the episode to Yassarian. It was the funniest goddamn thing you ever saw. None of the Mae Wests would work because Milo had stolen the carbon dioxide to make those ice cream sodas you bastards have been getting in the officers' mess. But that wasn't too bad, as it turned out. Only one of us couldn't swim, and we lifted that guy up into the raft after Orr had worked it over by its rope right up against the fuselage while we were all still standing on the plane. That little crackpot sure has a knack for things like that. Then the other raft came loose and drifted away, so that all 6 of us wound up sitting in one with our elbows and legs pressed so close against each other you almost couldn't move without knocking the guy next to you out of the raft into the water. The plane went down about 3 seconds after we left it and we were out there all alone, and right after that we began unscrewing the caps on our Mae Wests to see what the hell had gone wrong and found those goddamn notes from Milo telling us that what was good for him was good enough for the rest of us. That bastard. Jesus, did we curse him, all except that buddy of yours, or, who just kept grinning as though for all he cared what was good for Milo might be good enough for the rest of us. I swear, you should have seen him sitting up there on the rim of the raft like the captain of the ship while the rest of us just watched him and waited for him to tell us what to do. He kept slapping his hands on his legs every few seconds as though he had the shakes and saying, "All right now, all right," and giggling like a crazy little freak, then saying, "All right now, all right," again, and giggling like a crazy little freak some more. It was like watching some kind of a moron. Watching him was all that kept us from going to pieces altogether during the first few minutes, what with each wave washing over us into the raft or dumping a few of us back into the water so that we had to climb back in again before the next wave came along and washed us right back out. It was sure funny. We just kept falling out and climbing back in. We had the guy who couldn't swim stretched out in the middle of the raft on the floor, but even there he almost drowned, because the water inside the raft was deep enough to keep splashing in his face. Oh, boy. Then Orr began opening up compartments in the raft, and the fun really began. First he found a box of chocolate bars and he passed those around so we sat there eating salty chocolate bars while the waves kept knocking us out of the raft into the water. Next he found some bouillon cubes and aluminum cups and made us some soup. Then he found some tea. Sure, he made it. Can't you see him serving us tea as we sat there soaking wet in water up to our ass? Now I was falling out of the raft because I was laughing so much. We were all laughing. And he was dead serious, except for that goofy giggle of his and that crazy grin. What a jerk. Whatever he found he used. He found some shark repellent and he sprinkled it right out into the water. He found some marker dye and he threw it into the water. The next thing he finds is a fishing line and dried bait, and his face lights up as though the air sea rescue launch had just sped up to save us before we died of exposure or before the Germans sent a boat out from Spezza to take us prisoner or machine gun us. In no time at all, Orr had that fishing line out into the water, trolling away as happy as a lark. "Lieutenant, what do you expect to catch?" I asked him. "Cod," he told me. And he meant it. And it's a good thing he didn't catch any, because he would have eaten that codfish raw if he had caught any, and would have made us eat it, too, because he had found this little book that said it was all right to eat codfish raw. The next thing he found was this little blue oar about the size of a Dixie cup spoon, and, sure enough, he began rowing with it, trying to move all 900 pounds of us with that little stick. Can you imagine? After that he found a small magnetic compass and a big waterproof map, and he spread the map open on his knees and set the compass on top of it. And that's how he spent the time until the launch picked us up about 30 minutes later, sitting there with that baited fishing line out behind him, with the compass in his lap and the map spread out on his knees, and paddling away as hard as he could with that dinky blue oar as though he was speeding to Majorca. Jesus! Sergeant Knight knew all about Majorca, and so did Orr, because Yossarian had told them often of such sanctuaries as Spain, Switzerland and Sweden where American flyers could be interned for the duration of the war under conditions of utmost ease and luxury merely by flying there. Yossarian was the squadron's leading authority on internment and had already begun plotting an emergency heading into Switzerland on every mission he flew into northernmost Italy. He would certainly have preferred Sweden, where the level of intelligence was high and where he could swim nude with beautiful girls with low, demurring voices and sire whole happy, undisciplined tribes of illegitimate Yossarians that the state would assist through parturition and launch into life without stigma, but Sweden was out of reach, too far away, and Yossarian waited for the piece of flak that would knock out one engine over the Italian Alps and provide him with the excuse for heading for Switzerland. He would not even tell his pilot he was guiding him there. Yossarian often thought of scheming with some pilot he trusted to fake a crippled engine and then destroy the evidence of deception with a belly landing, but the only pilot he really trusted was Mquat, who was happiest where he was and still got a big boot out of buzzing his plane over Yossarian's tent or roaring in solo over the bathers at the beach that the fierce wind from his propellers slashed dark furrows in the water and whipped sheets of spray flapping back for seconds afterward. Dobbs and Hungry Joe were out of the question, and so was Orr, who was tinkering with the valve of the stove again when Yossarian limped despondently back into the tent after Dobbs had turned him down. The stove Orr was manufacturing out of an inverted metal drum stood in the middle of the smooth cement floor he had constructed. He was working sedulously on both knees. Yossarian tried paying no attention to him and limped wearily to his cot and sat down with a labored, drawn-out grunt. Prickles of perspiration were turning chilly on his forehead. Dobbs had depressed him. Doc Danica depressed him. An ominous vision of doom depressed him when he looked at Orr. He began ticking with a variety of internal tremors. Nerves twitched, and the vein in one wrist began palpitating. Orr studied Yossarian over his shoulder, his moist lips drawn back around convex rows of large buck teeth. Reaching sideways, he dug a bottle of warm beer out of his footlocker, and he handed it to Yossarian after prying off the cap. Neither said a word. Yossarian sipped the bubbles off the top and tilted his head back. Orr watched him cunningly with a noiseless grin. Yossarian eyed Orr guardedly. Orr snickered with a slight, mucid sibilance and turned back to his work, squatting. Yossarian grew tense. "Don't start," he begged in a threatening voice, both hands tightening around his beer bottle. "Don't start working on your stove." Orr cackled quietly. "I'm almost finished." "No, you're not. You're about to begin. Here's the valve. See? It's almost all together. And you're about to take it apart. I know what you're doing, you bastard. I've seen you do it 300 times." Orr shivered with glee. "I want to get the leak in this gasoline line out," he explained. "I've got it down now to where it's only a noose." "I can't watch you," Yossarian confessed tonelessly. "If you want to work with something big, that's okay. But that valve is filled with tiny parts, and I just haven't got the patience right now to watch you working so hard over things that are so goddamn small and unimportant. Just because they're small doesn't mean they're unimportant. I don't care. Once more? When I'm not around. You're a happy imbecile and you don't know what it means to feel the way I do. Things happen to me when you work over small things that I can't even begin to explain. I find out that I can't stand you. I start to hate you, and I'm soon thinking seriously about busting this bottle down on your head or stabbing you in the neck with that hunting knife there. Do you understand?" Orr nodded very intelligently. "I won't take the valve apart now," he said, and began taking it apart, working with slow, tireless, interminable precision, His rustic, ungainly face bent very close to the floor, picking painstakingly at the minute mechanism in his fingers with such limitless, blotting concentration that he seemed scarcely to be thinking of it at all. Yossarian cursed him silently and made up his mind to ignore him. "What the hell's your hurry with that stove, anyway?" he barked out a moment later in spite of himself. "It's still hot out. We're probably going swimming later. What are you worried about the cold for? The days are getting shorter," Orr observed philosophically. "I'd like to get this all finished for you while there's still time. You'll have the best stove in the squadron when I'm through. It will burn all night with this feed control I'm fixing, and these metal plates will radiate the heat all over the tent. If you leave a helmet full of water on this thing when you go to sleep, you'll have warm water to wash with all ready for you when you wake up. Won't that be nice? If you want to cook eggs or soup, all you'll have to do is set the pot down here and turn the fire up." "What do you mean, me?" Yossarian wanted to know. "Where are you going to be?" Orr's stunted torso shook suddenly with a muffled spasm of amusement. "I don't know," he exclaimed, and a weird, wavering giggle gushed out suddenly through his chattering buck teeth like an exploding jet of emotion. He was still laughing when he continued, and his voice was clogged with saliva. "If they keep on shooting me down this way, I don't know where I'm going to be." Yossarian was moved. "Why don't you try to stop flying, or? You've got an excuse. I've only got 18 missions. But you've been shot down on almost every one. You're either ditching or crash landing every time you go up." "Oh, I don't mind flying missions. I guess they're lots of fun. You ought to try flying a few with me when you're not flying lead. Just for laughs. Tee-hee." Or gazed up at Yossarian through the corners of his eyes with a look of pointed mirth. Yossarian avoided his stare. "They've got me flying lead again. When you're not flying lead. If you had any brains, do you know what you'd do? You'd go right to Pilchard and Wren and tell them you want to fly with me. And get shot down with you every time you go up? What's the fun in that? That's just why you ought to do it," Orr insisted. "I guess I'm just about the best pilot around now when it comes to ditching or making crash landings. It would be good practice for you." "Good practice for what?" "Good practice in case you ever have to ditch or make a crash landing. Tee-hee-hee. Have you got another bottle of beer for me?" Yossarian asked morosely. "Do you want to bust it down on my head?" This time Yossarian did laugh. "Like that whore in that apartment in Rome?" Orr sniggered lewdly, his bulging crab-apple cheeks blowing outward with pleasure. "Do you really want to know why she was hitting me over the head with her shoe?" he teased. "I do know," Yossarian teased back. "Natalie's whore told me." Orr grinned like a gargoyle. "No she didn't." Yossarian felt sorry for Off. Orr was so small and ugly. Who would protect him if he lived? Who would protect a warm-hearted, simple-minded gnome like Orr from rowdies and cliques and from expert athletes like Appleby who had flies in their eyes and would walk right over him with swaggering conceit and self-assurance every chance they got? Yossarian worried frequently about Orr. Who would shield him against animosity and deceit, against people with ambition and the embittered snobbery of the big shot's wife, against the squalid, corrupting indignities of the profit motive and the friendly neighborhood butcher with inferior meat? Or was a happy and unsuspecting simpleton with a thick mass of wavy polychromatic hair parted down the center? He would be mere child's play for them. They would take his money, screw his wife and show no kindness to his children. Yossarian felt a flood of compassion sweep over him. Or was an eccentric midget, a freakish, likable dwarf with a smutty mind and 1,000 valuable skills that would keep him in a low-income group all his life. He could use a soldering iron and hammer two boards together so that the wood did not split and the nails did not bend. He could drill holes. He had built a good deal more in the tent while Yossarian was away in the hospital. He had filed or chiseled a perfect channel in the cement so that the slender gasoline line was flush with the floor as it ran to the stove from the tank he had built outside on an elevated platform. He had constructed andirons for the fireplace out of excess bomb parts and had filled them with stout silver logs, and he had framed with stained wood the photographs of girls with big breasts he had torn out of cheesecake magazines and hung over the mantelpiece. Or could open a can of paint. He could mix paint, thin paint, remove paint. He could chop wood and measure things with a ruler. He knew how to build fires. He could dig holes, and he had a real gift for bringing water for them both in cans and canteens from the tanks near the mess hall. He could engross himself in an inconsequential task for hours without growing restless or bored, as oblivious to fatigue as the stump of a tree, and almost as taciturn. He had an uncanny knowledge of wildlife and was not afraid of dogs or cats or beetles or moths, or of foods like scrod or tripe. Yossarian sighed drearily and began brooding about the rumored mission to Bologna. The valve ore was dismantling was about the size of a thumb and contained 37 separate parts, excluding the casing, many of them so minute that ore was required to pinch them tightly between the tips of his fingernails as he placed them carefully on the floor in orderly, catalogued rows, never quickening his movements or slowing them down, never tiring, never pausing in his relentless, methodical, monotonous procedure unless it was to leer at Yossarian with maniacal mischief. Yossarian tried not to watch him. He counted the parts and thought he would go clear out of his mind. He turned away, shutting his eyes, but that was even worse, for now he had only the sounds, the tiny maddening, indefatigable, distinct clicks and rustles of hands and weightless parts. Or was breathing rhythmically with a noise that was stertorous and repulsive. Yossarian clenched his fists and looked at the long bone-handled hunting knife hanging in a holster over the cot of the dead man in the tent. As soon as he thought of stabbing Orr, his tension eased. The idea of murdering Orr was so ridiculous that he began to consider it seriously with queer whimsy and fascination. He searched the nape of Orr's neck for the probable site of the medulla oblongata. Just the daintiest stick there would kill him and solve so many serious, agonizing problems for them both. "Does it hurt?" Orr asked at precisely that moment, as though by protective instinct. Yossarian eyed him closely. "Does what hurt?" "Your leg," said Orr with a strange, mysterious laugh. "You still limp a little." "It's just a habit, I guess," said Yossarian, breathing again with relief. "I'll probably get over it soon." Orr rolled over sideways to the floor and came up on one knee, facing toward Yossarian. "Do you remember," he drawled reflectively, with an air of labored recollection, "that girl who was hitting me on the head that day in Rome?" He chuckled at Yossarian's involuntary exclamation of tricked annoyance. "I'll make a deal with you about that girl. I'll tell you why that girl was hitting me on the head with her shoe that day if you answer one question." "What's the question?" "Did you ever screw Nately's girl?" Yossarian laughed with surprise. "Me? No. Now tell me why that girl hit you with her shoe." "That wasn't the question," Orr informed him with victorious delight. "That was just conversation. She acts like you screwed her." "Well, I didn't." "How does she act?" "She acts like she don't like you." "She doesn't like anyone." "She likes Captain Black," Orr reminded. "That's because he treats her like dirt. Anyone can get a girl that way. She wears a slave bracelet on her leg with his name on it. He makes her wear it to needle Nately. She even gives him some of the money she gets from Nately. Listen, what do you want from me? Did you ever screw my girl?" "Your girl? Who the hell is your girl?" "The one who hit me over the head with her shoe." "I've been with her a couple of times," Yossarian admitted. "Since when is she your girl?" "What are you getting at?" "She don't like you, either." "What the hell do I care if she likes me or not? She likes me as much as she likes you. Did she ever hit you over the head with her shoe?" "Or, I'm tired. Why don't you leave me alone?" Tee hee hee. "How about that skinny countess in Rome and her skinny daughter-in-law?" Or persisted impishly with increasing zest. "Did you ever screw them?" "Oh, how I wish I could," sighed Yossarian honestly, imagining, at the mere question, the prurient, used, decaying feel in his petting hands of their teeny, pulpy buttocks and breasts. They don't like you either, commented Orr. They like Harvey, and they like Natalie, but they don't like you. Women just don't seem to like you. I think they think you're a bad influence. Women are crazy, Yossarian answered, and waited grimly for what he knew was coming next. How about that other girl of yours? Or asked with a pretense of pensive curiosity. The fat one? The bald one? You know, that fat bald one in Sicily with the turban who kept sweating all over us all night long? Is she crazy too? Didn't she like me either? How could you do it to a girl with no hair? How was I supposed to know she had no hair? I knew it, Orr bragged. I knew it all the time. You knew she was bald? Yossarian exclaimed in wonder. No, I knew this valve wouldn't work if I left a part out, Orr answered, glowing with cranberry red elation because he had just duped Yossarian again. Will you please hand me that small composition gasket that rolled over there? It's right near your foot. No it isn't. Right here, said Orr, and took hold of something invisible with the tips of his fingernails and held it up for Yossarian to see. Now I'll have to start all over again. I'll kill you if you do. I'll murder you right on the spot. Why don't you ever fly with me? Orr asked suddenly, and looked straight into Yossarian's face for the first time. That's the question I want you to answer. Why don't you ever fly with me? Yossarian turned away with intense shame and embarrassment. I told you why. They've got me flying lead bombardier most of the time. That's not why, Orr said, shaking his head. You went to Pilchard and Wren after the first Avignon mission and told them you didn't ever want to fly with me. That's why, isn't it? Yossarian felt his skin turn hot. No I didn't, he lied. Yes you did, Orr insisted equably. You asked them not to assign you to any plane piloted by me, Dobbs or Hoople because you didn't have confidence in us at the controls. And Pilchard and Wren said they couldn't make an exception of you because it wouldn't be fair to the men who did have to fly with us. So? Said Yossarian. It didn't make any difference then, did it? But they've never made you fly with me. Or, working on both knees again, was addressing Yossarian without bitterness or reproach, but with injured humility, which was infinitely more painful to observe, although he was still grinning and snickering, as though the situation were comic. You really ought to fly with me, you know. I'm a pretty good pilot, and I'd take care of you. I may get knocked down a lot, but that's not my fault, and nobody's ever been hurt in my plane. Yes, sir, if you had any brains, you know what you'd do? You'd go right to Pilchard and Wren and tell them you want to fly all your missions with me. Yossarian leaned forward and peered closely into Orr's inscrutable mask of contradictory emotions. Are you trying to tell me something? Tee-hee-hee-hee, Orr responded. I'm trying to tell you why that big girl with the shoe was hitting me on the head that day. But you just won't let me. Tell me. Will you fly with me? Yossarian laughed and shook his head. You'll only get knocked down into the water again. Or did get knocked down into the water again when the rumored mission to Bologna was flown, and he landed his single-engine plane with a smashing jar on the choppy, windswept waves tossing and falling below the warlike black thunder clouds mobilizing overhead. He was late getting out of the plane and ended up alone in a raft that began drifting away from the men in the other raft and was out of sight by the time the air-sea rescue launch came plowing up through the wind and splattering raindrops to take them aboard. Night was already falling by the time they were returned to the squadron. There was no word of Orr. Don't worry, reassured Kid Sampson, still wrapped in the heavy blankets and raincoat in which he had been swaddled on the boat by his rescuers. He's probably been picked up already if he didn't drown in that storm. It didn't last long. I bet he'll show up any minute. Yossarian walked back to his tent to wait for Orr to show up any minute and lit a fire to make things warm for him. The stove worked perfectly, with a strong, robust blaze that could be raised or lowered by turning the tap Orr had finally finished repairing. A light rain was falling, drumming softly on the tent, the trees, the ground. Yossarian cooked a can of hot soup to have ready for Orr and ate it all himself as the time passed. He hard-boiled some eggs for Orr and ate those too. Then he ate a whole tin of cheddar cheese from a package of K rations. Each time he caught himself worrying, he made himself remember that Orr could do everything and broke into silent laughter at the picture of Orr in the raft as Sergeant Knight had described him, bent forward with a busy, preoccupied smile over the map and compass in his lap, stuffing one soaking wet chocolate bar after another into his grinning, tittering mouth as he paddled away dutifully through the lightning, thunder and rain with the bright blue useless toy or the fishing line with dried bait trailing out behind him. Yossarian really had no doubt about Orr's ability to survive. If fish could be caught with that silly fishing line, Orr would catch them, and if it was codfish he was after, then Orr would catch a codfish, even though no codfish had ever been caught in those waters before. Yossarian put another can of soup up to cook and ate that too when it was hot. Every time a car door slammed, he broke into a hopeful smile and turned expectantly toward the entrance, listening for footsteps. He knew that any moment Orr would come walking into the tent with big, glistening, rain-soaked eyes, cheeks and buck teeth, looking ludicrously like a jolly New England oysterman in a yellow oilskin rain hat and slicker numerous sizes too large for him, and holding up proudly for Yossarian's amusement a great dead codfish he had caught. But he didn't. 29 Beckham. There was no word about Orr the next day, and Sergeant Whitcomb, with commendable dispatch and considerable hope, dropped a reminder in his titular file to send a form letter over Colonel Cathcart's signature to Orr's next of kin when 9 more days had elapsed. There was word from General Beckham's headquarters, though, and Yossarian was drawn to the crowd of officers and enlisted men in shorts and bathing trunks buzzing in grumpy confusion around the bulletin board just outside the orderly room. "What's so different about this Sunday, I want to know?" Hungry Joe was demanding vociferously of Chief White Halfoot. "Why won't we have a parade this Sunday when we don't have a parade every Sunday?" "Huh?" Yossarian worked his way through to the front and let out a long, agonized groan when he read the terse announcement there. "Due to circumstances beyond my control, there will be no big parade this Sunday afternoon." Colonel Syscope Dobbs was right. They were indeed sending everyone overseas, even Lieutenant Syscope, who had resisted the move with all the vigor and wisdom at his command and who reported for duty at General Beckham's office in a mood of grave discontent. General Beckham welcomed Colonel Syscope with effusive charm and said he was delighted to have him. An additional colonel on his staff meant that he could now begin agitating for 2 additional majors, 4 additional captains, 16 additional lieutenants and untold quantities of additional enlisted men, typewriters, desks, filing cabinets, automobiles and other substantial equipment and supplies that would contribute to the prestige of his position and increase his striking power in the war he had declared against General Dreedel. He now had 2 full colonels, General Dreedel had only 5, and 4 of those were combat commanders. With almost no intriguing at all, General Beckham had executed a maneuver that would eventually double his strength. And General Dreedel was getting drunk more often. The future looked wonderful, and General Peckham contemplated his bright new colonel enchantedly with an effulgent smile. In all matters of consequence, General P.P. Peckham was, as he always remarked when he was about to criticize the work of some close associate publicly, a realist. He was a handsome, pink-skinned man of 53. His manner was always casual and relaxed, and his uniforms were custom-made. He had silver-gray hair, slightly myopic eyes and thin, overhanging, sensual lips. He was a perceptive, graceful, sophisticated man who was sensitive to everyone's weaknesses but his own and found everyone absurd but himself. General Beckham laid great, fastidious stress on small matters of taste and style. He was always augmenting things. Approaching events were never coming, but always upcoming. It was not true that he wrote memorandums praising himself and recommending that his authority be enhanced to include all combat operations. He wrote memoranda. And the prose in the memoranda of other officers was always turgid, stilted, or ambiguous. The errors of others were inevitably deplorable. Regulations were stringent, and his data never was obtained from a reliable source, but always were obtained. General Beckham was frequently constrained. Things were often incumbent upon him, and he frequently acted with greatest reluctance. It never escaped his memory that neither black nor white was a color, and he never used verbal when he meant oral. He could quote glibly from Plato, Nietzsche, Montaigne, Theodore Roosevelt, the Marquis de Sade and Warren G. Harding. A virgin audience like Colonel Syscope was grist for General Beckham's mill, a stimulating opportunity to throw open his whole dazzling erudite treasure house of puns, wisecracks, slanders, homilies, anecdotes, proverbs, epigrams, apothegms, bon mots and other pungent sayings. He beamed urbanely as he began orienting Colonel Syscope to his new surroundings. "My only fault," he observed with practiced good humor, watching for the effect of his words, "is that I have no faults." Colonel Syscope didn't laugh, and General Beckham was stunned. A heavy doubt crushed his enthusiasm. He had just opened with one of his most trusted paradoxes, and he was positively alarmed that not the slightest flicker of acknowledgement had moved across that impervious face, which began to remind him suddenly, in hue and texture, of an unused soap eraser. Perhaps Colonel Syscope was tired, General Beckham granted to himself charitably. He had come a long way, and everything was unfamiliar. General Beckham's attitude toward all the personnel in his command, officers and enlisted men, was marked by the same easy spirit of tolerance and permissiveness. He mentioned often that if the people who worked for him met him halfway, he would meet them more than halfway, with the result, as he always added with an astute chuckle, that there was never any meeting of the minds at all. General Beckham thought of himself as aesthetic and intellectual. When people disagreed with him, he urged them to be objective. And it was indeed an objective Peckham who gazed at Colonel Syscope encouragingly and resumed his indoctrination with an attitude of magnanimous forgiveness. "You've come to us just in time, Syscope. The summer offensive has petered out, thanks to the incompetent leadership with which we supply our troops, and I have a crying need for a tough, experienced, competent officer like you to help produce the memoranda upon which we rely so heavily to let people know how good we are and how much work we're turning out. I hope you're a prolific writer." "I don't know anything about writing," Colonel Syscope retorted sullenly. "Well, don't let that trouble you," General Beckham continued with a careless flick of his wrist. "Just pass the work I assign you along to somebody else and trust to luck. We call that delegation of responsibility. Somewhere down near the lowest level of this coordinated organization I run are people who do get the work done when it reaches them, and everything manages to run along smoothly without too much effort on my part. I suppose that's because I am a good executive. Nothing we do in this large department of ours is really very important, and there's never any rush. On the other hand, it is important that we let people know we do a great deal of it. Let me know if you find yourself short-handed. I've already put in a requisition for 2 majors, 4 captains and 16 lieutenants to give you a hand. While none of the work we do is very important, it is important that we do a great deal of it. Don't you agree?" "What about the parades?" Colonel Syscope broke in. "What parades?" inquired General Peckham with a feeling that his Polish just wasn't getting across. "Won't I be able to conduct parades every Sunday afternoon?" Colonel Syscope demanded petulantly. "No. Of course not. Whatever gave you that idea?" "But they said I could." "Who said you could?" "The officers who sent me overseas. They told me I'd be able to march the men around in parades all I wanted to." "They lied to you." "That wasn't fair, sir. I'm sorry, Syscope. I'm willing to do everything I can to make you happy here, but parades are out of the question. We don't have enough men in our own organization to make up much of a parade, and the combat units would rise up in open rebellion if we tried to make them march. I'm afraid you'll just have to hold back a while until we get control. Then you can do what you want with the men." "What about my wife?" Colonel Syscope demanded with disgruntled suspicion. "I'll still be able to send for her, won't I?" "Your wife? Why in the world should you want to? A husband and wife should be together." That's out of the question also. But they said I could send for her. They lied to you again. They had no right to lie to me. Colonel Syskopf protested, his eyes wetting with indignation. Of course they had a right, General Beckham snapped with cold and calculated severity, resolving right then and there to test the mettle of his new colonel under fire. Don't be such an ass, Syskopf. People have a right to do anything that's not forbidden by law, and there's no law against lying to you. Now, don't ever waste my time with such sentimental platitudes again. Do you hear? Yes, sir, murmured Colonel Syskopf. Colonel Syskopf wilted pathetically, and General Beckham blessed the fates that had sent him a weakling for a subordinate. A man of spunk would have been unthinkable. Having won, General Beckham relented. He did not enjoy humiliating his men. If your wife were a walk, I could probably have her transferred here. But that's the most I can do. She has a friend who's a walk, Colonel Syskopf offered hopefully. I'm afraid that isn't good enough. Have Mrs. Syskopf join the walks if she wants to, and I'll bring her over here. But in the meantime, my dear Colonel, let's get back to our little war, if we may. Here, briefly, is the military situation that confronts us. General Beckham rose and moved toward a rotary rack of enormous colored maps. Colonel Syskopf blanched. We're not going into combat, are we? He blurted out in horror. Oh, no, of course not, General Beckham assured him indulgently, with a companionable laugh. Please give me some credit, won't you? That's why we're still down here in Rome. Certainly, I'd like to be up in Florence, too, where I could keep in closer touch with XPFC Wintergreen. But Florence is still a bit too near the actual fighting to suit me. General Beckham lifted a wooden pointer and swept the rubber tip cheerfully across Italy from one coast to the other. These, Syskopf, are the Germans. They're dug into these mountains very solidly in the Gothic line and won't be pushed out till late next spring, although that isn't going to stop those clods we have in charge from trying. That gives us in special services almost 9 months to achieve our objective. And that objective is to capture every bomber group in the U.S. Air Force. After all, said General Beckham with his low, well-modulated chuckle, if dropping bombs on the enemy isn't a special service, I wonder what in the world is. Don't you agree? Colonel Syskopf gave no indication that he did agree, but General Beckham was already too entranced with his own loquacity to notice. Our position right now is excellent. Reinforcements like yourself keep arriving, and we have more than enough time to plan our entire strategy carefully. Our immediate goal, he said, is right here. And General Beckham swung his pointer south to the island of Pianosa and tapped it significantly upon a large word that had been lettered on there with black grease pencil. The word was Dreidel. Colonel Syskopf, squinting, moved very close to the map, and for the first time since he entered the room a light of comprehension shed a dim glow over his stolid face. I think I understand, he exclaimed. Yes, I know I understand. Our first job is to capture Dreidel away from the enemy. Right? General Beckham laughed benignly. No, Syskopf. Dreidel's on our side, and Dreidel is the enemy. General Dreidel commands 4 bomb groups that we simply must capture in order to continue our offensive. Conquering General Dreidel will give us the aircraft and vital bases we need to carry our operations into other areas. And that battle, by the way, is just about won. General Beckham drifted toward the window, laughing quietly again, and settled back against the sill with his arms folded, greatly satisfied by his own wit and by his knowledgeable, blasé impudence. The skilled choice of words he was exercising was exquisitely titillating. General Beckham liked listening to himself talk, like most of all listening to himself talk about himself. General Dreidel simply doesn't know how to cope with me, he gloated. I keep invading his jurisdiction with comments and criticisms that are really none of my business, and he doesn't know what to do about it. When he accuses me of seeking to undermine him, I merely answer that my only purpose in calling attention to his errors is to strengthen our war effort by eliminating inefficiency. Then I ask him innocently if he's opposed to improving our war effort. Oh, he grumbles and he bristles and he bellows, but he's really quite helpless. He's simply out of style. He's turning into quite a souse, you know. The poor blockhead shouldn't even be a general. He has no tone at all. Thank God he isn't going to last. General Peckham chuckled with jaunty relish and sailed smoothly along toward a favorite learned illusion. I sometimes think of myself as Fortinbras, in the play Hamlet by William Shakespeare, who just keeps circling and circling around the action until everything else falls apart, and then strolls in at the end to pick up all the pieces for himself. Shakespeare is, I don't know anything about plays, Colonel Syskope broke in bluntly. General Peckham looked at him with amazement. Never before had a reference of his to Shakespeare's hallowed Hamlet been ignored and trampled upon with such rude indifference. He began to wonder with genuine concern just what sort of shithead the Pentagon had foisted on him. What do you know about? He asked acidly. Parades, answered Colonel Syskope eagerly. Will I be able to send out memos about parades? As long as you don't schedule any. General Peckham returned to his chair still wearing a frown. And as long as they don't interfere with your main assignment of recommending that the authority of special services be expanded to include combat activities. Can I schedule parades and then call them off? General Peckham brightened instantly. Why, that's a wonderful idea. But just send out weekly announcements postponing the parades. Don't even bother to schedule them. That would be infinitely more disconcerting. General Peckham was blossoming spryly with cordiality again. Yes, Syskope, he said, I think you've really hit on something. After all, what combat commander could possibly quarrel with us for notifying his men that there won't be a parade that coming Sunday? We'd be merely stating a widely known fact. But the implication is beautiful. Yes, positively beautiful. We're implying that we could schedule a parade if we chose to. I'm going to like you, Syskope. Stop in and introduce yourself to Colonel Cargill and tell him what you're up to. I know you two will like each other. Colonel Cargill came storming into General Peckham's office a minute later in a furor of timid resentment. I've been here longer than Syskope, he complained. Why can't I be the one to call off the parades? Because Syskope has experience with parades, and you haven't. You can call off USO shows if you want to. In fact, why don't you? Just think of all the places that won't be getting a USO show on any given day. Think of all the places each big-name entertainer won't be visiting. Yes, Cargill, I think you've hit on something. I think you've just thrown open a whole new area of operation for us. Tell Colonel Syskope I want him to work along under your supervision on this. And send him in to see me when you're through giving him instructions. Colonel Cargill says you told him you want me to work along under his supervision on the USO project, Colonel Syskope complained. I told him no such thing, answered General Peckham. Confidentially, Syskope, I'm not too happy with Colonel Cargill. He's bossy and he's slow. I'd like you to keep a close eye on what he's doing and see if you can't get a little more work out of him. He keeps butting in, Colonel Cargill protested. He won't let me get any work done. There's something very funny about Syskope, General Peckham agreed reflectively. Keep a very close eye on him and see if you can't find out what he's up to. Now he's butting into my business. Colonel Syskope cried. Don't let it worry you, Syskope, said General Peckham, congratulating himself on how adeptly he had fit Colonel Syskope into his standard method of operation. Already his two colonels were barely on speaking terms. Colonel Cargill envies you because of the splendid job you're doing on parades. He's afraid I'm going to put you in charge of bomb patterns. Colonel Syskope was all ears. What are bomb patterns? Bomb patterns? General Peckham repeated, twinkling with self-satisfied good humor. A bomb pattern is a term I dreamed up just several weeks ago. It means nothing, but you'd be surprised at how rapidly it's caught on. Why, I've got all sorts of people convinced I think it's important for the bombs to explode close together and make a neat aerial photograph. There's one colonel in Pianosa who's hardly concerned anymore with whether he hits the target or not. Let's fly over and have some fun with him today. It will make Colonel Cargill jealous, and I learned from Wintergreen this morning that General Dreedel will be off in Sardinia. It drives General Dreedel insane to find out I've been inspecting one of his installations while he's been off inspecting another. We may even get there in time for the briefing. They'll be bombing a tiny undefended village, reducing the whole community to rubble. I have it from Wintergreen. Wintergreen's an ex-sergeant now, by the way, that the mission is entirely unnecessary. Its only purpose is to delay German reinforcements at a time when we aren't even planning an offensive. But that's the way things go when you elevate mediocre people to positions of authority. He gestured languidly toward his gigantic map of Italy. Why, this tiny mountain village is so insignificant that it isn't even there. They arrived at Colonel Cathcart's group too late to attend the preliminary briefing and hear Major Danby insist, but it is there, I tell you. It's there, it's there. It's where? Dunbar demanded defiantly, pretending not to see. It's right there on the map where this road makes this slight turn. Can't you see this slight turn on your map? No, I can't see it. I can see it, volunteered Havermeyer, and marked the spot on Dunbar's map. And here's a good picture of the village right on these photographs. I understand the whole thing. The purpose of the mission is to knock the whole village sliding down the side of the mountain and create a roadblock that the Germans will have to clear. Is that right? That's right, said Major Danby, mopping his perspiring forehead with his handkerchief. I'm glad somebody here is beginning to understand. These two armored divisions will be coming down from Austria into Italy along this road. The village is built on such a steep incline that all the rubble from the houses and other buildings you destroy will certainly tumble right down and pile upon the road. What the hell difference will it make? Dunbar wanted to know, as Yossarian watched him excitedly with a mixture of awe and adulation. It will only take them a couple of days to clear it. Major Danby was trying to avoid an argument. Well, it apparently makes some difference to headquarters, he answered in a conciliatory tone. I suppose that's why they ordered the mission. Have the people in the village been warned? Asked Mquat. Major Danby was dismayed that Mquat too was registering opposition. No, I don't think so. Haven't we dropped any leaflets telling them that this time we'll be flying over to hit them? Asked Yossarian. Can't we even tip them off so they'll get out of the way? No, I don't think so. Major Danby was swearing some more and still shifting his eyes about uneasily. The Germans might find out and choose another road. I'm not sure about any of this. I'm just making assumptions. They won't even take shelter, Dunbar argued bitterly. They'll pour out into the streets to wave when they see our planes coming, all the children and dogs and old people. Jesus Christ. Why can't we leave them alone? Why can't we create the roadblock somewhere else? Asked Mquat. Why must it be there? I don't know, Major Danby answered unhappily. I don't know. Look, fellows, we've got to have some confidence in the people above us who issue our orders. They know what they're doing. The hell they do, said Dunbar. What's the trouble? Inquired Colonel Corn, moving leisurely across the briefing room with his hands in his pockets and his tan shirt baggy. Oh, no trouble, Colonel, said Major Danby, trying nervously to cover up. We're just discussing the mission. They don't want to bomb the village, Havermeyer snickered, giving Major Danby away. You prick. Yossarian said to Havermeyer. You leave Havermeyer alone, Colonel Corn ordered Yossarian curtly. He recognized Yossarian as the drunk who had accosted him roughly at the officers' club one night before the first mission to Bologna, and he swung his displeasure prudently to Dunbar. Why don't you want to bomb the village? It's cruel, that's why. Cruel? Asked Colonel Corn with cold good humor, frightened only momentarily by the uninhibited vehemence of Dunbar's hostility. Would it be any less cruel to let those two German divisions down to fight with our troops? American lives are at stake, too, you know. Would you rather see American blood spilled? American blood is being spilled. But those people are living up there in peace. Why can't we leave them the hell alone? Yes, it's easy for you to talk, Colonel Korn jeered. You are safe here in Pianosa. It won't make any difference to you when these German reinforcements arrive, will it? Dunbar turned crimson with embarrassment and replied in a voice that was suddenly defensive. Why can't we create the roadblock somewhere else? Couldn't we bomb the slope of a mountain or the road itself? Would you rather go back to Bologna? The question, asked quietly, rang out like a shot and created a silence in the room that was awkward and menacing. Yossarian prayed intensely, with shame, that Dunbar would keep his mouth shut. Dunbar dropped his gaze, and Colonel Korn knew he had won. No, I thought not, he continued with undisguised scorn. You know, Colonel Cathcart and I have to go to a lot of trouble to get you a milk run like this. If you'd sooner fly missions to Bologna, Spezia, and Ferrara, we can get those targets with no trouble at all. His eyes gleamed dangerously behind his rimless glasses, and his muddy jowls were square and hard. Just let me know. I would, responded Havermeyer eagerly with another boastful snicker. I like to fly into Bologna straight and level with my head in the bomb site and listen to all that flak pumping away all around me. I get a big kick out of the way the men come charging over to me after the mission and call me dirty names. Even the enlisted men get sore enough to curse me and want to take socks at me. Colonel Korn chucked Havermeyer under the chin jovially, ignoring him, and then addressed himself to Dunbar and Yossarian in a dry monotone. You've got my sacred word for it. Nobody is more distressed about those lousy wops up in the hills than Colonel Cathcart and myself. Mais c'est la guerre. Try to remember that we didn't start the war and Italy did. That we weren't the aggressors and Italy was. And that we couldn't possibly inflict as much cruelty on the Italians, Germans, Russians and Chinese as they're already inflicting on themselves. Colonel Korn gave Major Danby's shoulder a friendly squeeze without changing his unfriendly expression. Carry on with the briefing, Danby. And make sure they understand the importance of a tight bomb pattern. Oh, no, Colonel, Major Danby blurted out, blinking upward. Not for this target. I've told them to space their bombs 60 feet apart so that we'll have a road block the full length of the village instead of in just one spot. It will be a much more effective road block with a loose bomb pattern. We don't care about the road block, Colonel Korn informed him. Colonel Cathcart wants to come out of this mission with a good clean aerial photograph he won't be ashamed to send through channels. Don't forget that General Peckham will be here for the full briefing, and you know how he feels about bomb patterns. Incidentally, Major, you'd better hurry up with these details and clear out before he gets here. General Peckham can't stand you. Oh, no, Colonel, Major Danby corrected obligingly. It's General Dreedel who can't stand me. General Peckham can't stand you either. In fact, no one can stand you. Finish what you're doing, Danby, and disappear. I'll conduct the briefing. Where's Major Danby? Colonel Cathcart inquired, after he had driven up for the full briefing with General Peckham and Colonel Syscope. He asked permission to leave as soon as he saw you driving up, answered Colonel Korn. He's afraid General Peckham doesn't like him. I was going to conduct the briefing anyway. I'd do a much better job. Splendid, said Colonel Cathcart. No. Colonel Cathcart countermanded himself an instant later when he remembered how good a job Colonel Korn had done before General Dreedel at the first Avignon briefing. I'll do it myself. Colonel Cathcart braced himself with the knowledge that he was one of General Peckham's favorites and took charge of the meeting, snapping his words out crisply to the attentive audience of subordinate officers with the bluff and dispassionate toughness he had picked up from General Dreedel. He knew he cut a fine figure there on the platform with his open shirt collar, his cigarette holder, and his close-cropped, gray-tipped curly black hair. He breezed along beautifully, even emulating certain characteristic mispronunciations of General Dreedel's, and he was not the least bit intimidated by General Peckham's new colonel until he suddenly recalled that General Peckham detested General Dreedel. Then his voice cracked, and all confidence left him. He stumbled ahead through instinct in burning humiliation. He was suddenly in terror of Colonel Syscophe. Another colonel in the area meant another rival, another enemy, another person who hated him. And this one was tough. A horrifying thought occurred to Colonel Cathcart. Suppose Colonel Syscophe had already bribed all the men in the room to begin moaning, as they had done at the first Avignon mission. How could he silence them? What a terrible black eye that would be. Colonel Cathcart was seized with such fright that he almost beckoned to Colonel Corn. Somehow he held himself together and synchronized the watches. When he had done that, he knew he had won, for he could end now at any time. He had come through in a crisis. He wanted to laugh in Colonel Syscophe's face with triumph and spite. He had proved himself brilliantly under pressure, and he concluded the briefing with an inspiring peroration that every instinct told him was a masterful exhibition of eloquent tact and subtlety. "Now, men," he exhorted. "We have with us today a very distinguished guest, General Peckham from Special Services, the man who gives us all our softball bats, comic books and USO shows. I want to dedicate this mission to him. Go on out there and bomb, for me, for your country, for God, and for that great American, General P.P. Peckham. And let's see you put all those bombs on a dime." 30 Dunbar Yossarian no longer gave a damn where his bombs fell, although he did not go as far as Dunbar, who dropped his bombs hundreds of yards past the village and would face a court-martial if it could ever be shown he had done it deliberately. Without a word even to Yossarian, Dunbar had washed his hands of the mission. The fall in the hospital had either shown him the light or scrambled his brains, it was impossible to say which. Dunbar seldom laughed anymore and seemed to be wasting away. He snarled belligerently at superior officers, even at Major Danby, and was crude and surly and profane even in front of the chaplain, who was afraid of Dunbar now and seemed to be wasting away also. The chaplain's pilgrimage to Wintergreen had proved abortive, another shrine was empty. Wintergreen was too busy to see the chaplain himself. A brash assistant brought the chaplain a stolen Zippo cigarette lighter as a gift and informed him condescendingly that Wintergreen was too deeply involved with wartime activities to concern himself with matters so trivial as the number of missions men had to fly. The chaplain worried about Dunbar and brooded more over Yossarian now that Orr was gone. To the chaplain, who lived by himself in a spacious tent whose pointy top sealed him in gloomy solitude each night like the cap of a tomb, it seemed incredible that Yossarian really preferred living alone and wanted no roommates. As a lead bombardier again, Yossarian had mquat for a pilot, and that was one consolation, although he was still so utterly undefended. There was no way to fight back. He could not even see mquat and the co-pilot from his post in the nose. All he could ever see was Arfie, with whose fustian, moon-faced ineptitude he had finally lost all patience, and there were minutes of agonizing fury and frustration in the sky when he hungered to be demoted again to a wing plane with a loaded machine gun in the compartment instead of the precision bomb sight that he really had no need for, a powerful, heavy 50 caliber machine gun he could seize vengefully in both hands and turn loose savagely against all the demons tyrannizing him, at the smoky black puffs of the flak itself, at the German anti-aircraft gunners below whom he could not even see and could not possibly harm with his machine gun even if he ever did take the time to open fire, at Havermeyer and Appleby in the lead plane for their fearless straight and level bomb run on the second mission to Bologna where the flak from 224 cannons had knocked out one of Orr's engines for the very last time and sent him down ditching into the sea between Genoa and La Spezia just before the brief thunderstorm broke. Actually, there was not much he could do with that powerful machine gun except load it and test fire a few rounds. It was no more use to him than the bomb sight. He could really cut loose with it against attacking German fighters, but there were no German fighters anymore, and he could not even swing it all the way around into the hopeless faces of pilots like Hoople and Dobbs and order them back down carefully to the ground, as he had once ordered Kid Sampson back down, Which is exactly what he did want to do to Dobbs and Hoople on the hideous first mission to Avignon the moment he realized the fantastic pickle he was in, the moment he found himself aloft in a wing plane with Dobbs and Hoople in a flight headed by Havermeyer and Appleby. Dobbs and Hoople? Hoople and Dobbs? Who were they? What preposterous madness to float in thin air 2 miles high on an inch or two of metal, sustained from death by the meager skill and intelligence of 2 vapid strangers, a beardless kid named Hoople and a nervous nut like Dobbs, who really did go nuts right there in the plane, running amok over the target without leaving his co-pilot's seat and grabbing the controls from Hoople to plunge them all down into that chilling dive that tore Yossarian's headset loose and brought them right back inside the dense flak from which they had almost escaped. The next thing he knew, another stranger, a radio gunner named Snowden, was dying in back. It was impossible to be positive that Dobbs had killed him, for when Yossarian plugged his headset back in, Dobbs was already on the intercom pleading for someone to go up front and help the bombardier. And almost immediately Snowden broke in, whimpering, "Help me. Please help me. I'm cold. I'm cold." And Yossarian crawled slowly out of the nose and up on top of the bomb bay and wriggled back into the rear section of the plane, passing the first aid kit on the way that he had to return for, to treat Snowden for the wrong wound, the yawning, raw, melon-shaped hole as big as a football in the outside of his thigh, the unsevered, blood-soaked muscle fibers inside pulsating weirdly like blind things with lives of their own, the oval, naked wound that was almost a foot long and made Yossarian moan in shock and sympathy the instant he spied it and nearly made him vomit. And the small, slight-tail gunner was lying on the floor beside Snowden in a dead faint, his face as white as a handkerchief, so that Yossarian sprang forward with revulsion to help him first. Yes, in the long run, he was much safer flying with Mquat, and he was not even safe with Mquat, who loved flying too much and went buzzing boldly inches off the ground with Yossarian in the nose on the way back from the training flight to break in the new bombardier and the whole replacement crew Colonel Cathcart had obtained after or was lost. The practice bomb range was on the other side of Pianosa, and, flying back, Mquat edged the belly of the lazing, slow cruising plane just over the crest of mountains in the middle and then, instead of maintaining altitude, jolted both engines open all the way, lurched up on one side and, to Yossarian's astonishment, began following the falling land down as fast as the plane would go, wagging his wings gaily and skimming with a massive, grinding, hammering roar over each rocky rise and dip of the rolling terrain like a dizzy gull over wild brown waves. Yossarian was petrified. The new bombardier beside him sat demurely with a bewitched grin and kept whistling wee. And Yossarian wanted to reach out and crush his idiotic face with one hand as he flinched and flung himself away from the boulders and hillocks and lashing branches of trees that loomed up above him out in front and rushed past just underneath in a sinking, streaking blur. No one had a right to take such frightful risks with his life. "Go up, go up, go up!" he shouted frantically at Mquat, hating him venomously, but Mquat was singing buoyantly over the intercom and probably couldn't hear. Yossarian, blazing with rage and almost sobbing for revenge, hurled himself down into the crawlway and fought his way through against the dragging weight of gravity and inertia until he arrived at the main section and pulled himself up to the flight deck, to stand trembling behind Mquat in the pilot's seat. He looked desperately about for a gun, a gray-black .45 automatic that he could cock and ram right up against the base of Mquat's skull. There was no gun. There was no hunting knife either, and no other weapon with which he could bludgeon or stab, and Yossarian grasped and jerked the collar of Mquat's coveralls in tightening fists and shouted to him to go up, go up. The land was still swimming by underneath and flashing by overhead on both sides. Mquat looked back at Yossarian and laughed joyfully as though Yossarian were sharing his fun. Yossarian slid both hands around Mquat's bare throat and squeezed. Mquat turned stiff. "Go up," Yossarian ordered unmistakably through his teeth in a low, menacing voice. "Or I'll kill you." Rigid with caution, Mquat cut the motors back and climbed gradually. Yossarian's hands weakened on Mquat's neck and slid down off his shoulders to dangle inertly. He was not angry anymore. He was ashamed. When Mquat turned, he was sorry the hands were his and wished there were some place where he could bury them. They felt dead. Mquat gazed at him deeply. There was no friendliness in his stare. "Boy," he said coldly, "you sure must be in pretty bad shape. You ought to go home." "They won't let me." Yossarian answered with averted eyes, and crept away. Yossarian stepped down from the flight deck and seated himself on the floor, hanging his head with guilt and remorse. He was covered with sweat. Mquat set course directly back toward the field. Yossarian wondered whether Mquat would now go to the operations tent to see Pilchard and Wren and request that Yossarian never be assigned to his plane again, just as Yossarian had gone surreptitiously to speak to them about Dobbs and Hoople and Orr unsuccessfully, about Arfie. He had never seen Mquat look displeased before, had never seen him in any but the most light-hearted mood, and he wondered whether he had just lost another friend. But Mquat winked at him reassuringly as he climbed down from the plane and joshed hospitably with the credulous new pilot and bombardier during the jeep ride back to the squadron, although he did not address a word to Yossarian until all four had returned their parachutes and separated and the two of them were walking side by side toward their own row of tents. Then Mquat's sparsely freckled tan Scotch-Irish face broke suddenly into a smile and he dug his knuckles playfully into Yossarian's ribs, as though throwing a punch. "You louse," he laughed. "Were you really going to kill me up there?" Yossarian grinned penitently and shook his head. "No. I don't think so. I didn't realize you got it so bad. Boy. Why don't you talk to somebody about it?" "I talk to everybody about it. What the hell's the matter with you? Don't you ever hear me? I guess I never really believed you. Aren't you ever afraid? Maybe I ought to be. Not even on the missions? I guess I just don't have brains enough." Mquat laughed sheepishly. "There are so many ways for me to get killed," Yossarian commented, "and you had to find one more." Mquat smiled again. "Say, I bet it must really scare you when I buzz your tent, huh?" "It scares me to death. I've told you that. I thought it was just the noise you were complaining about." Mquat made a resigned shrug. "Oh, well, what the hell," he sang. "I guess I'll just have to give it up." But Mquat was incorrigible, and, while he never buzzed Yossarian's tent again, he never missed an opportunity to buzz the beach and roar like a fierce and low-flying thunderbolt over the raft in the water and the secluded hollow in the sand where Yossarian lay feeling up Nurse Duckett or playing hearts, poker or pinochle with Nately, Dunbar, and Hungry Joe. Yossarian met Nurse Duckett almost every afternoon that both were free and came with her to the beach on the other side of the narrow swell of shoulder-high dunes separating them from the area in which the other officers and enlisted men went swimming nude. Nately, Dunbar and Hungry Joe would come there, too. Mquat would occasionally join them, and often Arfie, who always arrived pudgily in full uniform and never removed any of his clothing but his shoes and his hat. Arfie never went swimming. The other men wore swimming trunks in deference to Nurse Duckett, and in deference also to Nurse Kramer, who accompanied Nurse Duckett and Yossarian to the beach every time and sat haughtily by herself 10 yards away. No one but Arfie ever made reference to the naked men sunbathing in full view farther down the beach or jumping and diving from the enormous whitewashed raft that bobbed on empty oil drums out beyond the silt sand. Nurse Kramer sat by herself because she was angry with Yossarian and disappointed in Nurse Duckett. Nurse Suan Duckett despised Arfie, and that was another one of the numerous fetching traits about Nurse Duckett that Yossarian enjoyed. He enjoyed Nurse Suan Duckett's long white legs and supple, capacious ass. He often neglected to remember that she was quite slim and fragile from the waist up and hurt her unintentionally in moments of passion when he hugged her too roughly. He loved her manner of sleepy acquiescence when they lay on the beach at dusk. He drew solace and sedation from her nearness. He had a craving to touch her always, to remain always in physical communication. He liked to encircle her ankle loosely with his fingers as he played cards with Nately, Dunbar, and Hungry Joe, to lightly and lovingly caress the downy skin of her fair, smooth thigh with the backs of his nails or, dreamily, sensuously, almost unconsciously, slide his proprietary, respectful hand up the shell-like ridge of her spine beneath the elastic strap of the top of the two-piece bathing suit she always wore to contain and cover her tiny, long-nippled breasts. He loved Nurse Ducket's serene, flattered response, the sense of attachment to him she displayed proudly. Hungry Joe had a craving to feel Nurse Ducket up, too, and was restrained more than once by Yossarian's forbidding glower. Nurse Ducket flirted with Hungry Joe just to keep him in heat, and her round light brown eyes glimmered with mischief every time Yossarian rapped her sharply with his elbow or fist to make her stop. The men played cards on a towel, undershirt, or blanket, and Nurse Ducket mixed the extra deck of cards, sitting with her back resting against a sand dune. When she was not shuffling the extra deck of cards, she sat squinting into a tiny pocket mirror, brushing mascara on her curling reddish eyelashes in a bird-brained effort to make them longer permanently. Occasionally she was able to stack the cards or spoil the deck in a way they did not discover until they were well into the game, and she laughed and glowed with blissful gratification when they all hurled their cards down disgustedly and began punching her sharply on the arms or legs as they called her filthy names and warned her to stop fooling around. She would prattle nonsensically when they were striving hardest to think, and a pink flush of elation crept into her cheeks when they gave her more sharp raps on the arms and legs with their fists and told her to shut up. Nurse Ducket reveled in such attention and ducked her short chestnut bangs with joy when Yossarian and the others focused upon her. It gave her a peculiar feeling of warm and expectant well-being to know that so many naked boys and men were idling close by on the other side of the sand dunes. She had only to stretch her neck or rise on some pretext to see 20 or 40 undressed males lounging or playing ball in the sunlight. Her own body was such a familiar and unremarkable thing to her that she was puzzled by the convulsive ecstasy men could take from it, by the intense and amusing need they had merely to touch it, to reach out urgently and press it, squeeze it, pinch it, rub it. She did not understand Yossarian's lust, but she was willing to take his word for it. Evenings when Yossarian felt horny, he brought Nurse Ducket to the beach with 2 blankets and enjoyed making love to her with most of their clothes on more than he sometimes enjoyed making love to all the vigorous paramoral girls in Rome. Frequently they went to the beach at night and did not make love, but just lay shivering between the blankets against each other to ward off the brisk, damp chill. The ink-black nights were turning cold, the stars frosty and fewer. The raft swayed in the ghostly trail of moonlight and seemed to be sailing away. A marked hint of cold weather penetrated the air. Other men were just starting to build stoves and came to Yossarian's tent during the day to marvel at Or's workmanship. It thrilled Nurse Ducket rapturously that Yossarian could not keep his hands off her when they were together, although she would not let him slip them inside her bathing shorts during the day when anyone was near enough to see. Not even when the only witness was Nurse Kramer, who sat on the other side of her sand dune with her reproving nose in the air and pretended not to see anything. Nurse Kramer had stopped speaking to Nurse Ducket, her best friend, because of her liaison with Yossarian, but still went everywhere with Nurse Ducket since Nurse Ducket was her best friend. She did not approve of Yossarian or his friends. When they stood up and went swimming with Nurse Ducket, Nurse Kramer stood up and went swimming, too, maintaining the same 10-yard distance between them, and maintaining her silence, snubbing them even in the water. When they laughed and splashed, she laughed and splashed. When they dived, she dived. When they swam to the sandbar and rested, Nurse Kramer swam to the sandbar and rested. When they came out, she came out, dried her shoulders with her own towel and seated herself aloofly in her own spot, her back rigid under a ring of reflected sunlight burnishing her light blonde hair like a halo. Nurse Kramer was prepared to begin talking to Nurse Ducket again if she repented and apologized. Nurse Ducket preferred things the way they were. For a long time she had wanted to give Nurse Kramer a rap to make her shut up. Nurse Ducat found Yossarian wonderful and was already trying to change him. She loved to watch him taking short naps with his face down and his arm thrown across her, or staring bleakly at the endless tame, quiet waves breaking like pet puppy dogs against the shore, scampering lightly up the sand a foot or two and then trotting away. She was calm in his silences. She knew she did not bore him, and she buffed or painted her fingernails studiously while he dozed or brooded and the desultory warm afternoon breeze vibrated delicately on the surface of the beach. She loved to look at his wide, long, sinewy back with its bronzed, unblemished skin. She loved to bring him to flame instantly by taking his whole ear in her mouth suddenly and running her hand down his front all the way. She loved to make him burn and suffer till dark, then satisfy him. Then kiss him adoringly because she had brought him such bliss.